been going on and will go on.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Eventually.
Yep.
More and more.
Yeah, I think those promises will be fulfilled, and God will restore them to the land. I think he has to do that because that's what he promised in the Old Testament. Remember? He said in Genesis 15, these are going to be the boundaries of your land. You're going to go from to the Mediterranean to the wilderness, all the way north to Damascus, and then south to the border of almost Egypt. Those borders have never been experienced by Israel. And so there's coming a day when he will, I think, fulfill those, and they will experience those boundaries. All right, let's go to chapter 13. And let's spend the rest of our time tonight on chapter 13. This is an incredible chapter. There is so much here, but it's full of details about the Antichrist and the false prophet. So remember I said we're going to introduce ourselves to the woman and the dragon and the male child and Michael the archangel. There are a couple other personalities that John introduces us to in these sections. And two of those we meet here in chapter 13, though, the Antichrist and the false prophet. So we've been kind of skirting the issue of the Antichrist. We've referred to him once back in chapter 11, but now we kind of get the biggest dose of our instruction on the Antichrist here in chapter 13. And then we're going to find out a little bit about this other second beast known as the false prophet. So anyone able to explain the difference between those? What is the Antichrist, and who is the false prophet, and how are they different? Terry?
Well, I think the Antichrist is more of a military, political type leader, and the false prophet is sort of more the, quote, religious leader.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good summary. So you've got Antichrist, who's going to be the political military leader. He's going to be the one that is Satan's primary vehicle to work through this age and be the world ruler. But he's got an assistant. He's got kind of someone who's going to point to him and say, worship him. What? Promoter. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He's got a promoter. He's got an agent. And this is the false prophet. And his whole purpose is to point people to the Antichrist. So you've got Satan, Antichrist, and you got the false prophet. Does that sound like something we're familiar with?
The unholy trinity.
The unholy trinity. Mm-hmm. Think about this. We have God the Father, we've got Christ, who is our Redeemer, and we've got the Holy Spirit, whose job is to point to Christ, magnify Christ. That's the whole purpose of the Spirit. The Spirit doesn't want any attention for himself. He doesn't want to draw any attention to himself. He wants to put all attention onto Christ, which, by the way, is one of the reasons I think the charismatic movement is gone so far off. They're making the Holy Spirit the whole focus, and speaking in tongues and magnifying the Spirit. The Spirit doesn't want to be magnified. The Spirit's whole purpose is to point to Christ, to make much of Christ. So that's our Holy Trinity. And should it surprise us that Satan, who is a counterfeit of everything that God is and stands for, he's going to try to duplicate it on his terms. And so Satan is going to be like God, or wants to be like God. You've got the Antichrist, who's going to be like Christ, and you've got the false prophet, who's going to reflect, in a sense, the ministry of the Holy Spirit, pointing to the Antichrist. So Satan's just copying something that already exists. He's ripping off something that's already in place. And so that's what we're going to see here in chapter 13. All right, so having said that, come to the Antichrist, and let's just kind of talk a little bit about this person. Now, think for a moment about what the world is going to be wanting at this moment. So think about all the devastation you've studied already in this book with the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments. Think about the bowl judgments that are coming. Think about all the devastation that has happened on the earth. Think about all the death that's occurred and all the ways that the nations are in an uproar. Imagine just for a moment, you're living in the earth during this time. We've talked about it already. We don't think we're going to be here because I think we hold to a preacher rapture, but I don't think we're going to be here. But imagine for a moment what it's going to be like. What do you want? If you're living on the earth at that time, what do you want? You want someone who will come and do what? Take care of you and protect you and bring some unity and solve these problems. I mean, these are massive global problems. You want someone who's going to be able to come along and try to navigate these issues and promise some hope and be able to bring some clarity and bring some unity and bring some harmony and solve these issues between the nations. That's what you want. Well, guess what? This person's going to show up. And the Antichrist is that person. He's going to bring a sense of security. He's going to be a strong leader. He's going to unify the world. He's going to bring some temporary peace. But notice the quote kind of in the middle of the page there, but he will turn out to be far more than the world bargained for. He will be a dictator, more cruel and powerful than any other leader the world has ever known. This man will be the culmination of a long line of would-be world conquerors. What men like Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors in ancient times and Hitler and Stalin in modern times only dreamed of doing, the Antichrist will actually do. He will rule the entire world and receive its worship. So this man's going to show up. And he's going to do what no person in the history of the world has been able to do. Napoleon couldn't do it. Alexander the Great couldn't do it. Hitler couldn't do it. He's going to be the first. And he's going to bring security and hope and unity and everything the world's looking for. All right? So let's meet him. Verse 1. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. By the way, that phrase in that verse should actually belong to the end of chapter 12. In my Bible, the next word "and" starts with a capital black letter. Is that how yours starts as well? So technically that probably belongs at the first part of chapter 13, verse 1, and the first phrase kind of normally should belong at the end of chapter 12 because it's coming off the dragon. So it's literally the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. And then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. So here's this beast. We met him back in chapter 11, but now we get this description here of him. Top of page 2, he's called the beast because of his savage, vicious, ferocious nature. He is literally going to be beast-like. He is going to be horrific. He's going to be a real person, but his nature will be vicious and ferocious. So hence the imagery of the beast. He will be, in essence, the culmination of all previous antichrists. Little a. Right? There's been all kinds of antichrists up to this point and up to that point. In fact, 1 John chapter 2, I think, says that. Doesn't it say that there will be many antichrists, little a antichrists? And so this is going to be the culmination of all of that. There's going to be the fulfillment, in the sense of every single person up to that point who thinks that they're a Savior, or thinks that they're a world deliverer, or thinks that they're Christ. And were we just talking about this at lunch, John, on Saturday? Did you mention David Koresh?
Oh.
And who was the guy in
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones? You remember these people? The guy who made everyone drink the Kool-Aid, and David Koresh, who thought he was the Messiah. I mean, there's all kinds of people like this in history. They think they are Christ, or they're the Antichrist, or however. They think they have that status. And so fast forward to the Antichrist, big A Antichrist, he's going to be, in a sense, that. Now, in those cases, most of them thought they were Christ. The Antichrist is going to be the opposite of that, but he's going to be the expression of all of those little a Antichrists. Okay? And he's described here as having 10 horns and 7 heads, a description similar to that of Satan back in chapter 12. Look back to chapter 12, verse 3, just back a few verses. It says, another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great dragon, red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems. And so you come over to chapter 13, verse 1, very similar description. Same kind of thing. He's got 10 horns, 7 heads, and on his horn were 10 diadems. So you can see there's a similarity here. There's a crossover. They're not the same individual, but there's an overlap here between Satan, who's described in chapter 12, and the Antichrist, who's described here in chapter 13. So not the same individual, but a lot of overlap, which makes sense if Satan is the one empowering Antichrist. So they're going to be similarly described. The 7 heads, we don't entirely know who they are. They could refer to those previous consecutive world powers, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia. He's going to be the culmination, in a sense, of all Gentile nations. We do know that the 10 horns symbolize power and strength, and they symbolize those 10 kings or those 10 nations that will comprise that revived Roman Empire. So we think that as you get towards this tribulation age, that nation that Antichrist will arise up through will be a revived Roman Empire. It will be a conglomerate of 10 nations in that day around Europe that make up this revived Roman Empire. The reason we believe that, and we've already talked about this, is because of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 and in chapter 7, and just knowing that under the first Roman phase of that Gentile kingdom, there was no 10-nation conglomerate. Okay, we know that the Roman Empire at that time, so 2,000 years ago, was not made up of a 10-nation confederacy. So we believe that Rome 2 is still future, and it's depicted by that statue with 10 toes, and it's depicted by the beast in Daniel 7 by the 10 horns. So we believe that that's a future phase of the Roman Empire, and Antichrist is going to come up through that conglomerate. Okay, so you ask me, who is it? I don't know, because I don't know who the players are, but certainly it's going to be probably this Western nations in that area that start to formulate a confederacy around the time of the start of the tribulation. And Antichrist will come up through that confederacy. We think of something.
I remember when the European Union first came into effect.
Yeah.
They were just certain this was going to be it, and then they brought in the euro, so that was going to be the one world currency.
Right.
It's,
And there's some interesting similarities there. I mean, in a sense, Europe is kind of unified through the European Union, and they do have a common currency. So it's not too far of a stretch to imagine how that will happen, and maybe it will be something like that. Some have suggested it will be the Roman Catholic Church that unifies that whole arena and that whole area, and that's a possibility. Maybe it's all part of that as well. So this is who he is. He's part of this 10-nation confederacy. Daniel 2 tells us that he's going to come up through that system, and he's going to be the leader over that. Daniel chapter 7. Look at Daniel 7, verse 8, which I think is very helpful here. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one. This is the Antichrist. Daniel 7, verse 8. The little horn came up among them, and 3 of his first horns were pulled up by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So apparently he's going to come up, he's going to dislodge 3 of those kings, and he's going to take over, in a sense, from them, or begin to rule over that 10-nation confederacy. Same thing in Daniel 7, verse 24. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. And he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. So he's going to come to power through this 10-nation confederacy. So you say how that's going to happen. I don't know all the details. I don't know how it's going to happen, but you can just imagine the ability to become the leader of 10 nations. You're going to have an oratorical ability. You're going to have be pretty slick-tongued. You're going to have to be pretty powerful, charismatic personality, strong leader, strong military individual, capable of solving all kinds of problems. And so maybe you can think of a Hitler-like individual. He had some of those traits, didn't he? Hitler did. He was very charismatic. He was strong politically. He was strong militarily. I don't think Hitler was the Antichrist, obviously, but Antichrist will be something like that, with all of those things wrapped up in his personality. Okay. Thoughts on this? Yeah, Rachel.
Well, it's just interesting, like, because we're so far through the tribulation, right? We're pretty far through the
At this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're at least at the midpoint.
Right.
Maybe
so
further.
At this point, though, so much of the world's already been wiped out, right? So it's interesting. It's like just to think that the nations will even still be established, in a sense, because they're going through this utter chaos. And I mean, just thinking like how many people will actually be left that the Antichrist can rule over, because there's going to be already so much destruction. So it's almost like those nations will have to very quickly rise again after they're kind of, I'm assuming with just all the devastation, that a lot of these nations are just going to crumble.
Yeah, I mean, what were the numbers we gave a few weeks ago? Was it 50% of the world population has been destroyed by this point?
Yeah.
So you're talking, billions and billions of people that are already dead.
Right.
But there's still going to be, 3 billion, 4 billion people on the earth. Still a lot of people that will be able to participate in his rebellion and that kind of thing. But
What about the countries that aren't mentioned, like the United States of America, for example? Like, where do you kind of think that they would be in the scheme of the tribulation, based on the nations that is that's kind of prophesied in Daniel 2?
10 toes.
Yeah. Will we be one of the 10 toes as a nation? I doubt it, because it seems like the Confederacy is more of a Western, European, Roman, it's over there. That's what it seems like. So I don't think we're going to be one of those 10 nations, but I think we'll be a nation still in existence. I just don't think we figure very prominently into the end times. I think we're going to be more of a subservient nation to someone or something else at that point. Because the focus of all of this is over there. It's not here. It's over there. So I'm not sure we have, as a country, a very big role in all of this. Obviously, it's speculation because it doesn't mention us anywhere in this section. So.
Well, that's the thing. Really, because Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, is what, 7?
Yeah.
7 countries?
Yep.
I don't know how many countries there are today, but there's more than that. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, what that looks like, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, those 7 are the big ones. If you look through history, those are the big Gentile kingdoms, with Rome being the last one. I don't think the United States figures very prominently into that at all.
Those nations all rule the world at some point.
Exactly. Yeah, where I wouldn't say we rule the world.
We think we do.
We think we do. We're a superpower, I guess you could
That's the
say.
thing. It's like today, a lot of people consider us the greatest power in the world. I mean, up against, I don't even know, China, maybe.
Yeah. But Tim's right, and you look at that list of nations there, they did have worldwide dominance. Doesn't mean that they ruled the world, but they had a worldwide dominance, which I don't think we have that today. So that's another reason why I don't think.
Geographically, that changed with the discoverers and exploration, and it became universal, where here it was more localized in those areas,
Yeah.
in those kingdoms, but it became a global scene after that time.
Whereas then it was more
It
localized.
really doesn't compare. Haven't some suggested that the USA is the wings of two eagles, or the eagle wings?
So we're an airplane.
Yeah.
So it could be an airplane or the USA. Right. Yeah, I don't think
Because
so.
of our eagle mascot.
Oh, because of the eagle mascot, yeah. Maybe it's prophetic. I'm just kidding.
I have heard, it's fascinating. I have heard people like kind of when they're reading through Revelation arguments, not that they're true, but saying like, what John was seeing, he probably couldn't describe in his worldview. Like if he saw a plane, he didn't know how to describe a plane. Like what's an airplane? So maybe and I remember hearing that, not saying that that's evil, but it was fascinating. Like they would give descriptions of like helicopters and like planes and try and
Yeah.
see the similarities between the descriptions that John was giving, and I just thought that was really
Yeah,
fascinating.
I've heard the same thing, that, yeah, there's tanks mentioned in here, and there's helicopters and F-16s, and that's just, that's baloney. Because you have to get into John's mind. That's what you do in interpreting Scripture. You have to get into John's mind, right? So would John, as a first century Christian, be thinking about these things? Of course not. Now, granted, he's seeing visions, and he's trying to describe those visions, but this is first century mindset. And he's a Jew, so there's all of that Old Testament coming to bear upon these things. So that's why we can't look at an eagle with two wings and assume it's an airplane. There has to be Old Testament allusions here that are in his mind, and so that is a danger. You have to guard it. It's fun, right? And it makes for great imagery, but yeah, Dale.
Somebody said that the U.S. isn't pictured there because most of the Christians, by this time, all the Christians have been raptured, so there's hardly anybody left in the United States.
Oh, right. Because we're a Christian nation, right? All 300 and whatever million of us.
Only 9%.
Actually, I think when the rapture happens, obviously there's going to be a large number of people taken out of the U.S., but I think it's smaller than we think.
Oh, yeah.
9%.
A lot of,
What?
I think it's down to 9% now.
9% you think would be considered true believers? I mean, it's obviously hard to gauge that, but I mean, what did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 7? The way is narrow and the gate is narrow that leads to life. So I don't think we're going to get to heaven and be surprised about who is, how do I say this? I think we're going to get to heaven and be surprised at who's not there. Because there's a lot of people in a lot of churches in America doing the Christian religious thing, and they're far from the Lord. So, it'll be interesting to see what kind of dent the rapture actually makes in the population of America. I think it'll be smaller than we think.
oh, yeah.
So
What is it?
Europe won't even know there was a rapture.
that's probably true, Wayne. In many cases, Europe won't even be affected by it. And unfortunately, you can look at Europe and see where America's going,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're just not that far behind Europe.
40 or 50 years.
We're probably 40 or 50 years behind Europe. So wherever they're going, wherever they are, wherever you can go there and you can see church buildings that are now bars and mosques and restaurants and museums. I mean, Europe largely is dead spiritually. And, give us another generation or two here in America, and I'm unfortunately thinking that that'll be a very similar case for us. So, we'll see. All right, notice something else on top of page 3. He's going to possess blasphemous names. You can see this at the end of chapter 13, verse 1. On his heads were blasphemous names, meaning he's going to identify himself as a god, similar to the way that Roman emperors designated themselves as gods. Remember the Caesars in that day, they essentially viewed themselves as gods, and they expected their people to worship them, much like Nebuchadnezzar expected people in his day to worship him. This is what it's going to be like. He is going to be blasphemous in the sense that he will identify himself as a god, expecting people to worship him. And we'll come back and talk about that more in just a minute. Look at verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his throne and his great authority. And so notice he uses the leopard, the bear, and the lion to illustrate what the kingdom of Antichrist will be like, or what he will be like. And notice the similarities here to the Gentile nations that occurred back in Daniel. Babylon was called the lion, Medo-Persia was called the bear, and Greece was called the leopard. So the same three animals, and those represented something each. Babylon depicted power in the lion. Medo-Persia was strong in similarity to the bear, and Greece was marked by swiftness, the swiftness of a leopard, and that's how Alexander the Great swept across the region and conquered the known world at that time. What's interesting about this is Antichrist embodies all of them. So those previous Gentile kingdoms that were marked by those things, those qualities or those virtues are now going to be essentially embodied all in Antichrist's empire, because he's seen here as all of them. So his empire is going to be a composite of those three previous Gentile kingdoms. So he's going to be powerful, he's going to be strong, and he's going to be swift.
Doesn't the lion also convey the regal aspect, the kingship?
Sure.
King of the beasts, that association. So
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And Babylon certainly was marked by that as well. So you can begin to just kind of think about the kingdom of this Antichrist and what it's going to be marked by. Yeah, Miriam.
Do you think that because he thinks he's a god, it'll kind of be like a communist, like government structure? Just because, I mean, if you look at like North Korea or even China, like, or Thailand, like the king promotes himself as like a godlike person.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is going to be a dictatorship. And he's going to be at the top. He's going to be in charge. He's going to be the ruler politically, militarily. And we're going to see in a minute, he's also going to view himself religiously as the leader of this nation. Now, false prophet is going to contribute to that. But it's going to be this conglomerate of a strong political, military, and religious entity. And he's going to be over all of it. So exactly right. I do believe he's going to view himself in that way, and we'll expect the world to worship him. In fact, we're going to see it in just a moment. Okay, so notice the end of verse 2. It says, the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So Satan is going to give to Antichrist power, throne, and great authority. So in essence, he's going to be the tool of Satan. So Satan is the one undermining all of this. He's the one in charge of all this. And he's actually going to delegate or give to Antichrist all of those things that will enable him to become the world leader. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine this. You know, we don't live in a day where someone takes over the world. I think the closest in our day that we could get to would be a Hitler, and that's 80 years ago now. I think it's hard for us to fathom this. But if Satan's underscoring it, if Satan is the one causing it, if Satan is the one putting all the pieces in place and satanically giving Antichrist the things he needs, the power, the oratorical ability, the authority, all of that, then you can start to now begin to think and imagine how this nation or this world will be dominated by one ruler. Okay. All right, so then we come to verses 3 and 4. Any thoughts on that? Verses 3 and 4 then are going to describe what Miriam just mentioned, his worship. And this is going to be an individual who literally does expect to be worshipped. And I want you to notice in verse 4, the word worship occurs twice. So verse 3 says, I saw one of his heads as if had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who is able to wage war with him. So notice verse 3, very interesting. What do you think verse 3 means? What is the fatal wound and it being healed? Do you have any idea of what we're talking about here? Very controversial passage. Lots of different views. What?
I remember when it was John F. Kennedy.
When it was John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, when he was assassinated.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, but he died.
A lot.
This one made it.
Well, resurrection in the future.
Yeah. He didn't resurrect
No,
him.
I'm just kind of
Derek?
being facetious, but a lot of people talked about the Kennedy assassination regard to this.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think he's trying to copy Christ.
Okay. He's trying to copy Christ in the sense that Christ was killed and then raised from the dead. Okay. Terry? Yeah, okay. Yeah, top of page 4. This is a very debated text as to what this means. How does Antichrist have this wound, which is as if he had been slain, and this fatal wound is healed? By the way, bottom of page 3, I forgot to mention this. The word slain literally means slaughtered to death, and it's the same word that refers back to the Lamb back in chapter 5 or 6, where, remember, Christ appeared in chapter 5 as the Lamb who was slain. Same term, same word here used. And so, and then down in verse 14, we learn that this was a wound by a sword. So look down in chapter 13, verse 14. It says, on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. So, again, it's very possible that he's going to be, or whoever, is killed with a sword, if that's literally what's taking place here. Now, let me back up and give you some possible interpretations of this and see what you think is right. So, top of page 4, some have suggested that the beast here is someone from the past or the present who will become the final world ruler. In other words, this wound and the person slain, the Antichrist slain, and then coming back to life may be, in their understanding, someone from the past who comes back and is the Antichrist. So Nero, I was reading a lot about Nero being believed to be this individual. Judas, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, the belief that perhaps there's someone from the past who's come back to be the Antichrist. That's one view. Others have believed it to be a reference to the destruction of pagan Roman Empire by the Christian Roman Empire, and then the future revival of the Roman Empire, and that's what the healing is. The healing is the revival of the Roman Empire. So in this case, they don't see it as an individual, they see it as a nation that was once in place, then kind of faded out, and then comes back into existence. And then, kind of similar to that, others believe it to be one of the previous kingdoms that was destroyed and then revived, a previous Gentile kingdom. Some reasons why we don't think any of those views are correct. Because number one, the term as if slain was used to refer to Christ, an individual, implying that this is also a person in this passage. So one of the reasons we think this is an actual person who has this wound is because the same term is used of Christ, who is a person. Although verse 3 speaks of one of the heads being slain, other passages specifically state that it is the beast himself who is slain. So look down in verse 12. It refers to an actual individual, the first beast, and then down in verse 14 also refers to the individual, the Antichrist. So it doesn't seem to be referring to a nation or a previous empire. It seems to be referring to an actual individual. And then added to that is this personal pronoun in the phrase, his fatal wound. And so look at verse 3. It says, his fatal wound was healed, implying it's an individual, his personal pronoun. It's his. It's not neuter. It's not referring to a nation. It's referring to an individual. And then added to that is it seems unlikely that the reviving of the Roman Empire would cause the whole world to be amazed. Verse 3 says the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. So it doesn't seem very likely if this is a revival of a kingdom or a revival of the Roman Empire, as much as that would happen if it was a revival of an individual. So all that to say, probably the best explanation is that this refers either to a literal death or a staged death and resurrection by Antichrist himself. So I would go with either one of those. Either he is really killed and God allows him to be resurrected somehow, or this is some sort of forgery, it's faked, it's sleight of hand, it's some sort of satanic counterfeit, that he's actually not dead, but somehow it's made to look like he died and raised back to life. Okay, So that's where I would land on one of those two. Either he is actually physically killed and raised back to life, or he is more likely, actually the latter one, is that this is some counterfeit of Christ's death and resurrection. I'm not sure we could prove from Scripture that Satan has the ability to raise someone back to life. That's the issue for me, is I don't think we see anywhere in Scripture where he can raise someone back to life. He can do a lot of supernatural things, and he's got power, which we'll talk about in a minute, to perform some significant supernatural signs, but I can't think of anywhere in Scripture where Satan is said to have the power to create life or to bring back to life. So that's why I would probably lean to this being some sort of deception, some sort of counterfeit, a staged death or a fake death, not a real death. Okay? Thoughts? Verse 3, the result of this is that the people of the earth are going to be amazed and will follow after the beast. So this is all part of God's plan, allowing Antichrist to be apparently invincible to death, and the result, verse 4, is because of this, they're going to follow him and they're going to worship him. They're going to worship the dragon, Satan himself, because he gave his authority to the beast, and they're going to worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who is able to wage war with him? What's the answer to those rhetorical questions? God is. There is one who is higher than the beast, God, and there is one who is able to wage war with him, God himself, and Satan and the Antichrist obviously are going to find that out here in a short period of time. But the whole earth is going to worship him. Verse 4 says, as the whole earth will worship the dragon and will worship the beast. And so this is staggering. You've got worldwide political domination, military domination, and for the most part, you've got worldwide worship of Antichrist. Now, obviously, the elect won't, the 144,000 won't, the others who are believers won't, but for the most part, the world will worship Satan and will worship his Antichrist. Look at 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, says, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. That's Satan's plan. That's what Satan's after. And that's what Satan has been after from the beginning. Look down at Isaiah 14, verse 14. Remember, we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, and we think that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 probably describe the fall of Satan. And so look, if that's the case, then look what Satan said in his original fall. He says, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. That's what Satan wants. He wants to be God. He wants to be on the throne. He wants God's honor. He wants to be all that God is. That's what kicked him out of heaven in the original rebellion, and that's what he's after in the tribulation. Okay? So his plan hasn't changed. You go back all the way to the beginning and see why he fell, because he wanted to be like God. Now you fast forward all the way to the end, or the tribulation, and you see what he's trying to do. He's trying to do the exact same thing. So his MO has not changed at all. He's still out to be God and to receive the worship that is due to God alone. So again, you can just get a window into Satan's heart here. He is luring people to worship him instead of God. This is the height of arrogance, isn't it? This is the height of absolute rebellion against the most holy God.
Are the Antichrist and the false prophet human? Or could they be demonic manifestations that appear human?
So your question is, are they demonic manifestations of human, or are they actual humans? I think they're actual humans who are possessed by demons. The reason I think that is because I don't think anywhere in Scripture we see demons who take the form of humans. Demons have to have a physical body to inhabit, to accomplish their work. Angels can manifest themselves as humans. Genesis 18, who shows up? Abraham's walking along, and who shows up? There's these people that show up. And so angels, good angels, don't need a physical body to manifest themselves. However, demons appear in Scripture to have a physical body to manifest themselves.
And they are always willingly participants,
Those individuals.
those individuals.
Exactly. So that's what I think what you have in this case is you have Antichrist, who is satanically put in place, and he's a willing vessel of Satan's purposes to be led by a demon. So I think you have, in both cases, you have two literal human individuals, both of whom are Satan's tools and demon-possessed. Does that answer your question? What are you thinking? Did you have more thoughts on that?
It just seems like some of the things they do imply abilities that, yes, Satan is empowering them, but it just seems like, and again, the wound that was supposedly fatal, if it's a manifestation as opposed to an actual human being, it could appear fatal. I hadn't thought about that before, it just...
Yeah. And you're exactly right. The things that they're doing, the signs, which we'll look at in just a moment, the signs are extraordinary. Look down in verse 13. This is of the false prophet. Now, he performs great signs, so that he makes fire come down from heaven in the presence of men. So yeah, there's some incredible signs going on here. In fact, in verse 15, I'm not sure we're going to get this far tonight, but in verse 15, the false prophet actually causes them, the people, to make an idol, and he gives breath to the image so this idol starts talking. So again, we'll talk about this. Is this really something that's alive or just fake, something? But you're right, the ability of the false prophet and Antichrist to do these signs and these wonders are incredible, and it's all because Satan is empowering them.
Well, the Antichrist is going to rule the world.
Yes.
Isn't that what Satan promised Christ when he tempted him?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Satan wanted to get Christ to put his allegiance in him, promising him to rule the world, but that's always been Satan's MO, is he wants that. Rachel, were you going to say something else?
No, it's just crazy. I'm just rereading this section, like how many, it seems like the beast is almost copying Jesus's time on earth, like everything that happened. Like,
Yeah.
You're right, it's a direct counterfeit, but what's so like kind of unsettling is that how do you know the difference? Because he was if he resurrects himself, that's how we claim to know that Christ was the Son of God, because he was resurrected. So I can see it's like if you read this section again, it's just like if you replace, I hope this doesn't sound like really bad, but if you like replace like the beast with Jesus, he did all of these things and people followed him.
Exactly.
So it's like that is so crazy.
Exactly.
It's just crazy.
In fact, how does Satan conduct himself? He's a
Deceiver.
He's a deceiver and a counterfeiter.
Yeah.
He disguises himself as an angel of light.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians 11. So it's no coincidence that the Holy Trinity is now manifest as the unholy Trinity through satanic efforts. That's not coincidental at all, because he is doing exactly what he's always done. He's been the deceiver. So, Dale, what were you going to say?
Well, Matthew 24:24 says that their signs will be performed that could deceive
Absolutely.
possibly even the elect.
Absolutely.
That's how good it will be.
Absolutely.
So if you're not elect, you're really in trouble.
Yep. This is slick on his part. This is absolutely slick. He's going to deceive the world with these signs and these wonders. So
I'm glad we won't be here. Good grief.
I know.
Because really, you almost like, can you blame, I guess, the people who are, if they see this, they witness this, good grief, it just, yeah.
We'll go over to 2 Thessalonians, while we're on this topic. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. talks exactly, this is part of God's judgment on the world, is this deception. So not only is Satan deceiving the world, but God is going to send a deluding influence. So look at verse 10, 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 10 and 11. Go up to verse 8. And then that lawless one, Antichrist, will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders. Exactly what we've been talking about. So Paul picks right up on this. He describes exactly what we've been saying. He, Antichrist, conducts himself by the activity of Satan, with all his power and signs and false wonders. Now look at verse 10. And with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. Look at that. Satan's going to twist the truth just enough to make it a deception of wickedness. And then verse 11, and for this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in wickedness. So on the one hand, Satan is going to be the master deceiver in the tribulation period, and he's going to trick all kinds of people with his signs and wonders through the Antichrist. And on top of that, God is actually going to send a deluding influence. He's going to do something that actually cements those people in their deception because they rejected the truth. So you've got a double dose.
That literally describes what we just read.
Exactly. It's almost a double dose of God's judgment upon the earth. Satan gets to deceive people, and God confirms them in their deception. So, very tremendous. Okay, back to chapter 13. Bottom of page 4. Then we get into Antichrist arrogance. And I want you to notice in verses 5 and 6, the word blasphemy or blasphemies occurs 3 times. This is the emphasis here. Verse 5, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him, and he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. 3 times, top of page 5, this word blasphemy occurs. And notice what he's going to blaspheme. Verse 6, he opened his mouth in blasphemies against 3 things. Against God, number 1, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that's the second thing. And then that is those who dwell in heaven, there's the third thing. So top of page 5, he will speak great things in blasphemies. Number 1, against God, his person. Number 2, his name and his tabernacle, which is his abode. And number 3, those who dwell in heaven, which is his people. So he's going to blaspheme all that God is and everything he stands for. And this is not just going to be kind of an isolated feature of his kingdom. This will define Antichrist's kingdom. He will be defined in everything he does, and his entire kingdom will be defined by this arrogance. Look at the verses from Daniel that I put in there. Now, Daniel 7, verse 8. This horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Verse 11 says, I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. Verse 25, he will speak out against the Most High. And verse 36 says he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. So think about the most arrogant, proud jerk that you've ever met. Don't be pointing fingers at anybody. Think about this most prideful, puffed up, self-focused, full of himself, herself individual, and magnify that a millionfold, and that's what you have in the Antichrist. He is that proud and that boastful. But he's going to be given, verse 5 says, authority to act for 42 months. So 42 months is 3.5 years. Again, we think this is the second half of the tribulation. And so who gives him this authority? I mean, obviously Satan does, but who gives Satan the authority?
Who allows it?
Exactly, God. God allows this. So even behind all of this, even in the midst of all of this pride and arrogance and blasphemy, God is sovereignly allowing Antichrist to do all of this at the period that God has determined. Again, he tells us what that period is, 42 months. So God has set the limits, he's allowed it to happen, and he set the time frame for it. So again, you can just kind of back up here in the book of Revelation, and there is still hope here. This world is not going to be totally out of control, and no, God is going to be sovereignly on his throne in the tribulation, just like he is in every other time period. All right. So, do you remember what was the big question people were asking back in 9/11? Where was God? You know where God was? He was on his throne on 9/11. He's on his throne today, and he's going to be on his throne in the tribulation, orchestrating all of these events for his ultimate purposes. So if you just need a reminder of the sovereign hand of God, and if you start to question that in your life, not that you're going to find a lot of hope in the tribulation, but just look at this. God is sovereignly orchestrating these events. And if he does that in that time period, does he not do that in our life as well? So it should be, in a sense, a hope for us. All right, and then his authority. Maybe we'll just try and get through this section here and see how far we get. His authority. Verses 7 to 10 talk about his authority. It was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. So notice verse 7 says, it was also given to him. Here's again another reference to the sovereignty of God. Okay, so you see it in verse 6 that he was given, actually verse 5, this authority was given to him. Now in verse 7, there's other reminder that it was given to him to make war with the saints. So he's actually going to be allowed to go to war against God's people. So there's going to be some sort of martyrdom. We've talked about that back in chapter 6 and 7. And so God will allow Antichrist to go to war against the saints and to overcome them, meaning he's going to kill them. Satan will kill through Antichrist. He will kill believers in the tribulation age. He won't destroy them spiritually, but he will kill them physically. And so those will become some of the martyrs of chapter 6 and 7. And then notice verse 7, he will have authority over every tribe and tongue and people and nation. So again, he's going to do what previous world dictators have tried to do. He's going to do what Nebuchadnezzar tried to do. He's going to do what Alexander the Great tried to do. He's going to do what Roman Caesars and emperors tried to do. He's going to do what Hitler tried to do. He is going to have authority over every tribe, people, and tongue and nation. So he's literally going to be the world ruler. He will dominate the world. He will be the world dictator. And notice verse 7, he will have authority over all who dwell on the earth, and they will worship him. All right, so they will worship him. That's actually verse 8. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. That phrase, all who dwell on the earth, is a technical term to refer to unbelievers. So unbelievers will worship him. So I want you to notice that in verse 7, you have this description of him as the political and military ruler over the world. And then in verse 8, he's described as the one that the earth will worship. So again, you can see this conglomerate of this political, military, and religious entity that all comes together under Antichrist. Okay, so we don't really have that today. We don't have really a political, military, religious dominating individual. But in the tribulation, you're going to have exactly that. And I put at the top of page 6, in a sense, you're going to have a one-world religion at this point. Right? That's what verse 8 says. It says that all who dwell on the earth will worship him. So you've got an ecumenical world religion at this point, and its focal point is a man empowered by Satan himself. So what have liberal churches been trying to do for decades, years? They're trying to unify the churches, right? This has been a big push all around the world. Liberal churches have been trying to get us all unified and get us all together, and let's just become one world church. Well, that day is coming. There will be a literal worldwide church, if you want to call it that. But chapter 17 is going to tell us that it's going to be an apostate church. So you have to come back in a couple of weeks, and we're going to look at this. This is actually an apostate church. It's filled with mostly unbelievers, really all unbelievers. But it's going to be part of this system. It's going to be part of this satanic, Antichrist-dominated political, military, religious entity that he's going to rule and reign over. Okay? Thoughts? Yeah, Rachel?
So verse 8, wait, do we already pass verse 8?
No, go ahead.
No. All those whose names have not been written in the book of life belong to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. That's what my version says, but
Yep.
I'm confused by that. Was slain from the creation of the world.
Okay, so in the best manuscripts, that phrase "from the creation of the world" does not appear. What version do you have?
NIV.
They have the NIV. So in some of the manuscripts, that phrase occurs. If you look in the New American Standard, does anyone have the New American Standard? What does it say at the end of verse 8? What's the last part of verse 8 say?
Written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain.
Okay, period. So we think in the best manuscripts, that phrase "from the creation of the world" does not appear. But some versions will put it in because in some manuscripts it does appear. So if it was in the original, your question is, what does it mean if it was in the original, from the creation of the world? How could Christ be slain from the creation of the world? Well, he obviously wasn't slain from the beginning of time, but he was destined to be slain from the beginning of time. So that's what it would mean if it is in the original text, but we don't know for sure if it was or wasn't. So, make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so verse 8, middle of page 6. What about this book of life issue? And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. So here's the second mention of the book of life. You look in your notes, the book of life is actually mentioned 7 times in the book of Revelation. The first one came back in chapter 3, verse 5, and then here's the second one, and then you can see the rest of those references in the rest of the book. Some think that the book of life originally contained the names of every living person, and the names of the unsaved are blotted out when they die. Go back to chapter 3, verse 5, because this is where this comes from. Go back to Revelation 3, verse 5. Some people think that the book of life had the names of every individual, and when they die in unbelief, then their names are erased from the book. And they think that because of verse 5 of chapter 3. He who overcomes shall thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. So some people read that and think, well, maybe he does erase names. So maybe if you're an unbeliever, your name gets erased after you die because you never believed. And so they read that into that text. I don't think that's what that text is saying. Go back to chapter 13. I think what we have to take as the book of life here is, I put it right in the middle of that page 6 in your notes tonight, but it is better to understand that those who are saved had their names written in the book of life from eternity past in anticipation of the death of Christ for them, and that they can never be removed from it. So in this case, verse 8 says, everyone in the world is going to worship at that time the beast, except those whose names are written in the book of life. So I take the book of life as the book of the elect. Those who in eternity past, God sovereignly chose to write the names in, and that's fixed. It's unchangeable, and that's how I would take that. Which, if you just think about that for a moment, if you're here tonight and you know Christ, the only reason you know Christ is because God sovereignly ordained it before the foundation of the world. That's just staggering. Just staggering that God would choose to set his affection upon certain individuals before the world began. And if that's true, and I think it is according to Ephesians 1 and other places, it's just all of grace, isn't it? Our salvation is all of grace. And God's mercy is that kind to us. So incredible to be included in the book of life. And then we'll wrap up with this. Verses 9 and 10 says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. What does that usually introduce? Just something important's coming, right? You should pay attention. Listen to what I'm about to say. And verse 10 tells us, says, if anyone is destined for captivity, by the way, before I go there, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. Go back to chapter 2, and let me show you something. Give you a little argument for a pre-trib rapture. Chapter 2, see if I can remember where these, chapter 2, verse
7.
Where is it, 7?
I think.
I'm in the wrong book. Revelation 2, verse 7. He who has an ear, let him hear. That's the same phrase we just saw in chapter 13. Now notice the next phrase. What the Spirit says to the churches. And if you keep reading in the rest of these two chapters, chapters 2 and 3, that is a common phrase. I can't find all the other ones. Where is it?
Verse 11.
17.
Okay. Verse 11. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Verse 17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And there's probably a couple more.
29. Verse
29. 29. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Chapter 3, verse 6. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Chapter 3, verse 13. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now go back to chapter 13. One more in chapter 20, verse 22. Okay. Now go back to chapter 13 and verse 9. What does it say? If anyone has an ear, let him hear. Why doesn't he say it to the churches? They're gone. I don't think they're there. I think it's an argument for a preacher rapture. He specifically removes that phrase. He could have said the exact same thing because he said it 6 times. Is it 6 or 7? 7 times previously. But here he doesn't repeat that phrase, which in my mind may be an argument from silence, but another argument for a preacher rapture. Bottom line, verse 10, he says, if anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with a sword he must be killed. Here's the perseverance and faith of the saints. This could be taken 2 ways. I'm not sure which way to take it. It could be referring to the destruction of Antichrist. In other words, if anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword, as Antichrist will, with the sword he must be killed. So one way to take that would be, this is what's going to happen to Antichrist, divine retribution. The other way to take this is it's just referring to what's going to happen to believers in that time. They're going to be taken captive, they're going to be killed, but believers will persevere and have faith. So I'm not sure which one to take. You could take it either way. All right. Well, we need to stop here. We'll have to finish the rest of chapter 13 and the false prophet next week. So thank you. Thanks for coming. Questions before we break? Rachel? Go ahead.
Sorry.
If you need to go ahead. Go ahead and be dismissed. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, so they call patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints.
Yeah,
That's the tribulation saints.
tribulation saints. Yep.
Basically, so in verse 8, like the contrast to that, all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. That doesn't mean that every single living person, it's just the ones that aren't elect.
Correct.
So the ones that have been saved through the tribulation, he's saying that they need to, he's asking for endurance and faithfulness
Yeah.
for them.
Yes. Yeah, that's what verse 8. Verse 8 says that not everyone will worship him, because there will be those whose names are written in the book of life. They won't worship him. So you're right. If verse 10 refers to the saints, then he's urging them to persevere in the midst of that time period.
Verse 10. I would go with the latter suggestion.
It's saints.
Beast and false prophet are named and cast alive in the lake of fire.
You're right. You're exactly right. Whereas tribulation saints, some of them will be martyred. Yeah, that makes sense. And the very last phrase of verse 10, here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. Seems to argue for the saints. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, can you recap that? What did you say?
He just said that in verse 10 it says, if anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. He's saying that probably doesn't refer to the Antichrist and the false prophet, because they're not ultimately killed. They're cast alive into the lake of fire. So that would be an argument in favor of option 2 at the bottom of page 6, that it's referring to believers, tribulation saints. That the reference in verse 10 is to tribulation saints, not to the false prophet.
If anyone is to be killed with the sword, he will be killed. Doesn't that seem like judgment?
It seems like judgment. That's why there's a divided view on this. It could be Antichrist who does kill with a sword, and he's going to have to be killed. But as John said, he's not going to be killed. He's going to be cast alive into the lake of fire. So that's why it's divided. I think the last phrase of verse 10.
Unless he's talking about like the false prophet, because the unholy trinity, one is spirit, one is probably a man, right? Who's like Antichrist. Antichrist could be killed, right? But Satan.
Yeah, I think they're both real individuals, but chapter 20 says they're cast alive into the lake
All
of
three of
fire.
them, the false prophet, the beast,
The beast and the false prophet.
the beast, the false prophet. But then there's Satan too.
Yeah, he's also cast alive into the lake of fire.